All right, good evening. My name is Philip McElman, and I'm a professor in the economics department here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land in which the lecture will take place tonight. The lecture is named after Professor Max Corden. Tonight will be the 19th Corden lecture. Max has had a long association with the university, doing his undergraduate and masters here, being a faculty member at the beginning of his academic career, and then also returning to be a faculty member as an emeritus professor towards the end of his career. Unfortunately, Max won't be able to make it tonight, but the lecture will be recorded, so he will have an opportunity. And so as we go through the lecture tonight, if you want Max to hear your voice, think of questions. Make sure they're pithy and sort of short, but you can give, you can sort of basically show Max some respect and appreciation by having good questions. Max is one of Australia's most eminent and famous economists. His area was international trade, but he also made important contributions to the field of international macro, international finance and economic development more generally. But he also had a couple of other strings to his bow. He was very engaged in policy, but he also had an extensive teaching career. And through that career, he was able to shape the minds of some of our greatest economists today. All right, so I'd like to, it's my great pleasure to introduce now Professor Ross Garnaut, who is tonight's speaker. Ross also is an eminent and distinguished economist. He, like Max, has followed that path of being both an incredibly successful academic, but possibly even more so than Max, he's played a leading role in public policy and public debate and has held public office as being an ambassador of Australia to China. He's made numerous contributions to public debate, ranging from economic development to industrial policy, and more recently to climate change. So it's my great pleasure and delight to turn things over to Ross to talk about these important issues of today.
Thanks, Philip. It's a great honour and pleasure to give this lecture in honour of Max. I think I've probably attended all of the Corden lectures, nearly all anyway, including one that Paul Krugman gave the day, just 2 days, 2 days before the 2019 election, and we arranged for Max and Paul Krugman and I to spend the day before, the afternoon before the election with the leader of the opposition, Bill Shorten, who hoped to be Prime Minister. That was an occasion in which Max's contributions didn't have the immediate consequences that they might have had. Max's most recent publication is his 2018 joint article with me in the Australian Economic Review, called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Trump. If we were writing today, the title might be The Economic Consequences of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, as there has been continuity across the two presidencies in the fiscal and trade policies that we discussed. President Biden has taken the Trumpian combination of increasing budget deficits and trade protection a step further in his Inflation Reduction Act, while increasing incentives for decarbonisation of the US economy. Max has been the economics profession's teacher, not just here, but globally. His published work and his lectures have always been models of clarity and precision. His book, Trade Policy and Economic Welfare, half a century ago, precisely and clearly set out nearly the whole of what is important for policy in thinking about international trade. His Inflation, Exchange Rates and the World Economy, 46 years ago, applied the best of international macroeconomic theory to understanding the new problems of a world disrupted by floating exchange rates, and high energy prices. In this lecture, I'm going to try to apply the approach that Max took to analysing economic problems and the wisdom in those two books to a great question of today: how should Australia respond to the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2022? Max has always worked on the big economic issues. In the first couple of decades, big economic issues of the day. The first couple of decades of his career here, then at the ANU, he worked on protection, which was the big economic policy issue of Australia in those days. While he was teaching at Oxford, you had the global monetary crisis and energy crisis of the 70s, and he turned to that as the great issue of the day. And in his book on inflation, exchange rates, and the world economy came out of that. And over the last decade, he's spent a lot of time thinking about the issues of climate change and decarbonisation. In launching Max's autobiography here at the university, called Lucky Boy in the Lucky Country, I described Max as a conservative, liberal, social democrat. For small minds, these four words together mean nothing in particular. In Max's case, each of the words adds content to a precise and rich concept. A democrat, because in the end, public choice should give similar weight to the preferences of all people. A social democrat, because society works better for its members if the state intervenes to raise the living standards of its poorer members, and in any case, democracy does not work in practice unless there is a reasonably equitable distribution of access to the civilising services. Liberal, because the preferences and freedoms of individuals of all ethnicity, beliefs and circumstances should be respected and defended against the preferences or decisions of a democratic majority when those preferences or decisions threaten to oppress individuals or minorities. And conservative, because poorly considered large change carries risks of unhappy unintended consequences, and because people prefer change from established conditions to be gradual and comprehensible. The conservative, the liberal, the social and the democrat have all been front of Max's mind through this last Melbourne decade, as he has dwelt more in his first decade as a boy in Germany. Identifying now as part of a German centre that could not hold against the assertion of extremes. He was deeply disturbed by the rise of Donald Trump, but took comfort from Trump lacking the strategic focus and intent of him. But what if a more disciplined and focused leader should come to power with the political views and values of Mr. Trump? Max maintained his characteristic self-discipline in his only writing about Mr. Trump, our article in the Australian Economic Review. Never write about anything in which you are not deeply expert. That has been his creed and practice. And when you write about that, be clear and precise. Mean exactly what you say, and make sure that your readers have no doubts about what you're saying. We noted in that article 5 years ago that the Trump administration had implemented two major initiatives in economic policy: cutting rates of corporate and personal income tax, leading to an increase in the budget deficit, and increasing barriers against imports. The increased protection was greatest against countries with which the US had large bilateral trade deficits, especially China. These initiatives were meant to increase growth in the United States economy as a whole, and especially to increase employment and incomes of workers employed in manufacturing. We sought to answer the question, what will be the effect of these policies? The consequences of Mr. Trump's first economic policy initiative, large tax cuts funded by a larger budget deficit, are primarily macroeconomic. They affect the broad economic aggregates. The consequences of the increases in protection are microeconomic, affecting the allocation of resources across different economic activities. The effects of an economic change depend on the circumstances in which it is implemented. The Trump policy changes came after a long, slow, but reasonably steady increase in US economic activity and reduction in unemployment after expansionary monetary policies to offset the effects of the great crash of 2008. At the time of Trump's election, the budget deficit had been falling with economic expansion, but remained high for the advanced stage of the business cycle and the relatively low unemployment. After the Trump election, public debt as a ratio of GDP continued to grow, and by 2018 had reached levels unprecedented except in wartime or its immediate aftermath. Easy money after the great crash of 2008 had supported a relatively low dollar exchange rate, helping US export industries, but not removing a persistent trade deficit. The low interest and exchange rates assisted a moderate expansion of manufacturing employment, including in the Rust Belt industrial states from about 2010. Unemployment had fallen to historically low levels. The rate of 3.5% in mid-2019 was the lowest since 1969 and judged by most economists to be at or a bit below or a bit above full employment. The macroeconomic part of our paper focused on the increase in the budget deficit and public debt to fund reductions in income tax rates for corporations and individuals. The tax cuts lead to an increase in domestic expenditure. Since there is near full employment, the increase in expenditure leads to an increase in inflation and the trade deficit. The monetary authorities respond to higher inflation by raising short-term interest rates, and higher inflation causes long-term rates to rise in the marketplace. Higher interest rates attract capital flow and place upward pressure on the nominal exchange rate. An appreciation of the real exchange rate from the combination of increased prices and an increase in the nominal exchange rate causes an increase in the trade deficit. The end of the process sees a larger trade deficit with the world as a whole. Total employment from these policies remains about the same as before the fiscal expansion because the starting point is full employment. Employment falls in industries producing tradable goods and services, including manufacturing, and rises in industries producing non-tradable goods and services. Mr. Trump wanted to reduce US trade deficits with China and some other countries and with the non-US world as a whole through increased restrictions on imports. We noted that the cost of protection is felt by both potential exporters and importers, by the US itself as much as its trading partners. We also noted that trade balances are determined by macroeconomic factors and not by policies which affect the allocation of resources across industries. President Trump wanted to reduce the trade deficit by protectionist policies, but his macroeconomic policies were in the way. In the US, the trade deficit was driven by investment being greater than savings, and one element of the low savings in the US was Mr. Trump's fiscal deficit. A trade surplus reflects a tendency for people in a country to value savings more than domestic investment at prevailing interest rates. A deficit in another country reflects a tendency there for people to value investment more than savings. That one country runs a deficit and another a surplus may reflect differences between many different characteristics of the country, and decisions on all of the factors affecting savings, investment, and therefore the trade deficit contain elements of preferences, although in countries other than the United States, there's always a risk of financial instability if things go too far. It's different in the country that issues the world's international currency. In reaction to the US protection, several responses are possible in the rest of the world. The best one for for the countries concerned, for the rest of the world, and also for the US and the world as a whole, is for the response to be actually to reduce protection when the US increases protection. This will offset, at least to some extent, the effects of the increase in US protection. Second best is to do nothing at all. And the worst is to increase protection in response to US protection, because that will further damage both the country imposing the increased protection and also the United States. Well, the protection was focused most on China, and China responded by retaliating, increasing protection against the United States and some of the US allies, and that further increased the damage from the protectionist responses. We noted that the Trump tax cuts and increase in budget deficits would temporarily raise average private incomes for Americans in general. However, the fiscal expansion would have to be reversed sooner or later, and the costs of reversal may exceed the benefits of the current intervention. The trade interventions would unambiguously lower incomes for Americans in general, with the costs possibly increased by other countries' protectionist responses. As it turned out, they were increased by those responses. We noted that workers in the steel and aluminium and other Rust Belt industries, the group that the Trump policies were meant to help, would share the temporary gain from parts of the tax cut and the expansion of domestic expenditure, but would lose from other aspects of the macroeconomic adjustment. We said that the trade deficit was certain to expand and not to fall. Well, what actually happened? President Trump was true to his word on increasing protection, especially, but not only, against China. The US domestic reality began to unfold as anticipated in our paper. The budget deficit rose, concerns rose about inflation and interest rates that raised the nominal and real exchange rates. In turn, that increased the budget deficit. That was all happening without, and actually employment didn't increase very much because the US was near full employment, and overall the rate of increase of employment in manufacturing industry slowed down from what it had been in the last 7 years of the Obama administration. Then came the pandemic. The economy quickly fell into deep recession. Employment fell and unemployment rose sharply. The price level started to fall. The pandemic had global reach, so it didn't greatly affect the trade balance or the exchange rate. And the immediate response of the US authorities, government and Reserve Bank, was to radically ease the fiscal policy even more tax cuts and plus increases in expenditure, and to ease monetary policy at an unprecedented rate and extent. President Biden took office immediately after legislation of Trump's second anti-recessionary fiscal package, when there was still anxiety about unemployment and recession. Biden retained virtually all of the protectionist elements of Trump's policy and took the fiscal expansion further with the American Rescue Plan in January 21, followed by the CHIPS and Science Act and a major a package on infrastructure. By early 2022, the Biden macroeconomic policy had been defined: unabated Trumpian protection and intensified Trumpian fiscal expansion. The ironically labelled Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 came next. This mainly provided tax rebates and subsidies related to production of zero-carbon goods and infrastructure. It was strongly protectionist, with many of the tax cuts and subsidies only being available if you spent the money on US goods or produce the goods or receive the subsidy for US production. Because the new measures had no caps on them, if you qualified, you got the tax cut or the subsidy without limit. It was very much more expansionary than the original announcements said that it would be. Well, that was huge fiscal expansion on top of what Trump already had in place. A recovery from the pandemic recession was swift. Economic growth in 2021 was the strongest after recovery in 1984 from the early 80s recession. Unemployment fell from the pandemic levels at the fastest rate on record. Supply chains had been severely disrupted by the pandemic, and that disruption continued right through 2022 because of the lockdowns in China. And the combination of that supply chain disruption and the huge demand expansion generated inflation, which peaked at 8.9% in the year to June 2022. US monetary policy was tightened more rapidly than ever before, with cash rates over a year, or 14 months, rising from just about 0 to 5.25%. So you continued with the very easy fiscal policies while tightening monetary policy, and that gives you a higher real exchange rate. That's basic international macro that Max talked about a lot in that book in the late 70s. In response, the trade deficit lifted to unprecedented levels, and it's still going much higher this year. Strong economic growth and low unemployment are usually associated with falling and low budget deficits. The continuing fiscal expansion through the Biden presidency made this time different. During the deep recession of the pandemic, the budget deficit was inevitably very large. It fell with recovery, but then started to increase again in 22 and again this year. In the first 11 months of the current financial year, the US fiscal year ends in September. I've only seen 11 months data, but it was a touch below 7% of GDP, which is unprecedented outside wartime and the great depths of the pandemic recession. Well, what are the effects of Mr. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, taking into account that macroeconomic framework? The effects of the the president calls it the IRA. His Irish background, I think he quite enjoys that. So I'll call it the IRA. The effects of the IRA on domestic and global decarbonisation are actually complex. The Biden IRA's massive support for production and purchase of zero carbon commodities is likely substantially to accelerate US decarbonisation. That has a positive effect on the international political dynamics of movement to net zero emissions. That effect may outweigh all others. The IRA contains large incentives for innovation in zero carbon goods and processes, which will have positive effects on decarbonisation in the US and the rest of the world. But there are countercurrents. The lift in the real exchange rate from bigger budget deficits and protection reduces competitiveness of US production in external markets. That reduces the likelihood that subsidisation will lead to the US becoming a large exporter of the zero carbon products that are being subsidised. Higher interest rates systematically increase the costs of zero carbon energy and goods because their production is generally much more capital intensive than traditional carbon intensive goods. Renewable energy is almost all capital, the majority of the costs of coal or gas-based energy is the recurrent cost of the raw material. The higher real interest rates set off by the US domestic macro policies are global in their reach. They make decarbonisation more costly everywhere. Apart from its macroeconomic effects through the real exchange rate, the higher protection increases the costs of US zero-carbon industry by diverting supply of inputs from low-cost international to high-cost domestic sources. This may not increase costs for zero-carbon production in the rest of the world, at least in countries that remain open to drawing inputs from the world's most competitive sources. The exclusion of US users and suppliers of equipment from global markets will have some effect in reducing gains from trade, that is, productivity, both in the US and in the rest of the world. Overall, the IRA makes it more likely that the US will contribute positively to the achievement of its own announced contribution to global goals for net emissions, although the effects are substantially diminished by the higher interest rates and increasing costs of inputs into zero-carbon goods production. Through the 21st century so far, a tendency for higher global savings and lower global investment has placed downward pressure on global real interest rates. Real interest rates on sovereign borrowing in countries considered to be safe for debt have been around zero in real terms over the decade to about a year ago, with a downward tendency over that period. David Vines wrote about that in our paper to the Conference of Economists in Brisbane recently. The high and rising US budget deficit has been a major factor in recent reversal of these favourable tendencies. With the US representing over a quarter of conventionally measured global incomes and expenditure, the US budget deficit has been heading towards 2% of global incomes. This is a drag on investment and growth in all industries everywhere, but especially in the capital-intensive industries of the zero-carbon economy, and especially in the developing world. In correspondence in the last couple of days with Australia's statistician, David Gruen, and also with David Vines, we've recognised that one can't simply attribute the increase in real long-term interest rates in recent months to the US budget deficit. There may be elements of market miscalculation of what should be the effects of that deficit, but nevertheless, the world's biggest economy, at current exchange rates, 27 or 28% of world GDP. If it runs a 7% budget deficit, it soaks up a lot of surplus savings in the rest of the world and puts considerable pressure on global real interest rates. The US measures have been emulated in other developed countries, notably Canada, the EU, the UK, Japan and Korea, not always in detail, usually with less protectionist content than the IRA, but usually also with some fiscal emulation, some weakening of budgets. So that's part of the overall impact. Accelerated innovation in production and use of zero-carbon goods in the US and elsewhere is one consequence of the US subsidies, and that's unambiguously favourable for the global decarbonisation effort. As I've mentioned, the overall impact is a complex one. The IRA specifically favours production in the US and some allied countries of inputs into zero-carbon goods, for which production is currently dominated by China. This has been called friendshoring in a meeting in Tokyo in May 2023 between the US President and the Australian Prime Minister. It was suggested that that trade between the US and Australia in zero-carbon goods should be preferential, and that this was good for supply chain security. Well, would this actually help supply chain security in any important way? Such measures could possibly serve Australian interests if they took the form of US investment in and purchase from Australian production in competition with other suppliers. Expanded Australian capacity would enhance global as well as Australian and US supply security for products in which Australia has comparative advantage. However, it would diminish Australia's development and probably Australia's contribution to global, Australian and maybe even US supply chain security if it led to truncation of competing trade and investment relationships with third countries. Well, more generally, should Australia emulate the Inflation Reduction Act? There are strong pressures from Australians wanting more action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions to emulate the IRA. There is pressure to elevate the priority of reducing emissions. There's pressure to use carrots, not sticks, in the form of subsidies that increase the budget deficit. There's pressure to subsidise the particular products favoured in the US by the IRA to avoid competitive disadvantage. There's pressure to introduce protection for domestic production of some zero-carbon goods. And there's pressure to favour use of supply chains in politically friendly countries. Here we should apply principles from international economics to assess whether and the extent to and manner in which Australian governments should respond positively to these pressures. The US making it clear that it will achieve its announced goals on reducing emissions allows all countries to plan for reducing emissions in greater confidence that they will be part of an effective international effort. It also increases the economic and international political costs of us failing to achieve our own emissions reduction objectives. So emulating the US into elevation of the priority of climate change mitigation is a thoroughly good thing. Standard economics tells us that the economically efficient way of elevating priority is by correcting divergence between the public value of an economic decision and market participants' benefits from taking the decision. That means taxing external costs or subsidising external benefits and efficient provision of public goods. That is the whole of the elevation of priority that is justified in the public interest. The balance of taxes and subsidies to deal with the externalities matters a great deal, in particular their effects on the budget balance. The standard Corden analysis tells us that when a large country shifts its preferences towards running larger budget and trade deficits, other countries should run larger surpluses. The Trump-Biden budget deficit strengthened the case for smaller budget, trade and current account deficits or larger surpluses in Australia. Our budget, trade and current accounts are currently in surplus. That reduces the cost to us from rising international interest rates driven by US policies. It puts us in a relatively strong position to manage shocks from the international economy, which have become more likely as a result of US budget policies. There is a strong case for maintaining reasonable budget discipline as we elevate the priority of climate change mitigation. Standard international economics also tells us that one country, especially a large economy, subsidising output of one product is a reason for reducing output of that product. You see that in Max's trade and trade policy and economic welfare. That doesn't matter if the first country is unlikely to be an important participant in world markets. And as I've already mentioned, it's unlikely that the US will be a major participant, partly because of the policies it's running, which will make it more inward-looking in general and in the zero-carbon industries in particular, but also because its relative resource endowments do not give it a large comparative advantage or disadvantage in the main zero-carbon products. By contrast, Australia has the economic endowments to be an immense exporter of zero-carbon goods. The densely populated high-income countries that have poor endowments of renewable energy in Europe and Northeast Asia are the large potential markets. Australia's solar and wind resources are at the centre of the opportunity. Other Australian advantages include its opportunity for sustainably growing biomass as an input into zero carbon production, and also Australia's legacy of infrastructure, skills and industrial culture from the old mining, forestry and agricultural industries. I've set that out in two recent books, Superpower in 2019 and the Superpower Transformation last year. So Australia being by far the world's biggest exporter of minerals and some other products that require a lot of energy or a lot of chemical reductants that are currently supplied by carbon, enhances its advantage, its comparative advantage in exporting zero carbon goods in the zero carbon world that is emerging. Australia is the low cost place to use Australian renewable energy to turn Australian iron ore or aluminium ore or silicon ore into iron metal or aluminium metal or silicon metal. A little bit about China's role. China recognized at an early stage that the world would decarbonize energy, transport and industry. Put quite a lot of effort a decade ago into establishing large industries supplying these products. The fact that it did that has greatly expanded global supply capacity in wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, batteries, electric cars. China's by far the world's biggest producer of all of these products. For some of them, overwhelming the world's biggest producer, produces more than 90% of the world's polysilicon for solar panels. Australia shares with other countries an interest in secure supply chains for zero carbon goods. Australia has the resources and capacity to be a globally competitive supplier of some of the products in which China is overwhelmingly the dominant supplier, including polysilicon, some rare earths that are crucial in the zero carbon economy, some battery materials. We will make a large contribution to global supply chain security, in particular the security of allied countries, by becoming a major global supplier of these products, those products in which we have comparative advantage. We actually weaken the contribution that we make if we seek to become a major exporter of products in which we don't have comparative advantage. Australia's specialisation in both exports and imports according to comparative advantage enhances its role as a supplier of zero carbon goods to those economies that cannot decarbonise from their own domestic resources at reasonable cost. And here I note that whether or not the densely populated, high-income industrial countries of Europe and Northeast Asia, in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, can meet their own commitments to zero carbon production, may depend on being able to import zero carbon goods from Australia and countries like Australia. They don't have the domestic renewable energy resources to do their own decarbonisation. So in playing this role in the world, we facilitate the achievement of global goals. We also set ourselves up for a long period of economic growth based on expansion of industries in which we've got strong comparative advantage. Now, in the written version of the paper, I discuss at some length the detailed policies that Australia can introduce, and I'll get this onto the website of the faculty over the next couple of days, and you can have it at leisure. But the important policies for Australia should all be built around internalising in private decisions some big externalities in the zero carbon world economy. first of these is the externality of carbon emissions itself. Nick Stern, long-time president of the Royal Society, eminent British economist, called the absence of a carbon price the greatest market failure in economic history. I don't think that that's any stretch to endorse that view. We had something that worked very well for 2 years. It not only internalized the external costs of carbon emissions, but it also generated a lot of revenue that could be used to fund the internalization of other costs that actually require subsidies for internalization. We lost that in what I think is by quite a long stretch the biggest act of economic policy vandalism that's ever been delivered to the Australian people, the abolition of carbon pricing. Right now, there's lots of discussion of economic reforms that could improve productivity and lift Australia's economic performance at a time of mediocre performance. Top of that list would be re-establishment of carbon pricing, but that's ruled out for the time being. No one's going to discuss that for the time being because of our bitter political history over carbon pricing over the past decade. So what do we do in its absence? Well, right at the centre of building Australia as the superpower of the zero emissions global economy is the use of our immense resources for renewable energy. And we do have a second best in that area. That second best is the renewable energy target. When I played a role in developing the set of policies that became carbon pricing, together with support for innovation through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and other measures, the policies that were in place to 2012 to 2014. Part of that was a renewable energy target that was going to get things going. It was a mandatory target. It required all users of energy to use a percentage of renewable energy that would rise over time. The way things were designed, the rising carbon price would make that redundant through the 2020s. But once we abolished carbon pricing, that's all we had. And it's second best, and Max taught us to look carefully for the second best if we've ruled out first best policies. It was second best, and it has been very effective, but it's due to run out soon. It will need to be extended and strengthened if, in the absence of carbon pricing, we're going to continue to get the investment we need in zero carbon energy. That can only handle the carbon externality for the electricity sector. Crucially important, more important than in any other sector, but there are others as well. What do we do about the carbon externality elsewhere in the economy? Well, the current government is heroically trying to introduce a form of carbon pricing through the safeguards mechanism, applied only to large companies. It's partial. There are caps on the pricing that probably are set below the true economic value of avoiding carbon emissions. Number of things wrong with them, but they might not be first or second best, but they are certainly helpful to the process, but they're only partial. They're only over some industries and lots of other activities, and all smaller economic activities that are not covered. A lot of thought needs to be given to developing mechanisms for recognising the cost of carbon emissions, positively by subsidising the alternatives, or negatively by constraining the carbon emissions activities in those other sectors. For the superpower industries, the big new industries that can be the main source of Australian economic expansion for the next 1 or 2 generations, we can get some support from other countries' carbon pricing. There's a premium on zero carbon goods in Europe, and that will become much stronger with the introduction in Europe of a border tax on goods with carbon in their supply chain from 2026. If we qualify as a zero carbon supplier, our producers will be able to attract the premium available in those markets. We'll have to be rigorous in certification of what really is zero carbon activity. One can expect the Europeans to be fastidious in policing the zero carbon content of the supply chains, because there'll be lots of protectionist interests that would like them to go too far. It will be a pretty rough process, but there's a chance of if we manage our own decarbonisation effectively, if we're seen as credible participants in the global effort, there's a chance that we will attract those premiums in Europe. For countries that don't have their own carbon pricing schemes, there will be no comparable carbon premium for the time being. Through voluntary markets, some producers may offer higher prices for zero carbon goods, but this is quite a challenge for Australian policy making in the period ahead. How to provide the recognition for the higher value of zero carbon goods in the absence of a carbon price, and in a world in which only some other countries have a carbon price. It's one of the issues that Rod Sims and I are putting some time into in the Superpower Institute that we've contributed to establishing. There's another big externality that we have to take into account if we're going to realise our potential to contribute to global decarbonisation and also to our own economic growth in the period ahead. And that's the externality associated with innovation, something that Beth Webster's done a lot of work on. When anyone who introduces a new technology, a new process, a new kind of product, takes a lot of risks, makes a lot of mistakes, learns a lot, and everyone else learns with them. You don't get enough innovation if you rely only on competitive markets, because a lot of the value of the pioneering effort is not captured by the pioneer herself. It's made available to everyone who follows. The business school just around the corner here teaches young business people they must not be pioneers in the use of a new technology. You must be a clever follower, looking at what others are doing and copying what works so that someone else will pay the costs of learning and mistakes. You follow, and the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth will make all the money. Bit different for Elon Musk. He's made a lot of money for innovation in his cars, but actually a big hunk of that was paid for by President Obama's carbon initiatives back in 2012. He took a very big loan to get Tesla started, and I was able to pay it back with success. But the government actually took a very large part of that risk of learning, and Tesla's success has helped a lot of other companies in the zero emissions field. So we need mechanisms for fiscal support for the first examples of all of the new industries, and we're going to need a lot of them. There's no commercially produced green iron now in the world. If the world is to deal with the climate problem, Australian iron ore will be turned into metal by processes other than burning coal. in the next couple of decades. The best, the most, the commercially most attractive of the possibilities now is using hydrogen made from renewable energy. Very expensive to ship hydrogen overseas. It will be made cheaply in Australia with our high-quality renewable energy resources. Unlike Australian metallurgical coal, you won't be able to ship it to Korea or Japan or China and Germany and turn Australian iron ore into iron metal and be internationally competitive. Australia will be the natural place to do that, but no one's doing it on a commercial scale yet. The first to do it will incur very great costs, and take risks, and others will learn from them. So we need general mechanisms for supporting innovation across the first players, the companies that show what is possible and how to do it, to begin the process of building the superpower. Some of these measures to internalise the externality in the absence of a carbon price will be challenging to the budget, and all the early part of my lecture tells us we've got to be careful about that. You can be quite counterproductive if you make yourself less competitive in everything by fiscal ease that gives you a higher real exchange rate and makes you less competitive generally. You've got to do it within a sound macroeconomic framework, and that's going to be one of the big challenges of managing Australia's preparation to be the superpower of the zero carbon world economy. So back to Max's lessons. Be clear and precise in policy analysis. President Biden's IRA increases pressure on Australia to meet and to elevate our decarbonisation targets. It increases the chances of the world meeting agreed international objectives on timely achievement of net zero emissions, and so it increases confidence in Australia's superpower opportunity. Australians are wise to emulate the commitment to achieving targets and increasing ambition, but we should be cautious in emulating the detail of the US approach. Clarity and precision in analysis suggests a caution in following the US into increases in debt-funded expenditures and tax cuts, no matter how desirable the objects of those cuts and expenditures. Clarity and precision suggest focus on identifying precisely the external costs and benefits as a focus for fiscal support. Clarity and precision urges a specialisation in both imports and exports according to comparative advantage. Clarity and precision shows the way to acceleration of action in many ways. The most important thing that we can do immediately, and it has no budgetary cost, is that extension and strengthening of the renewable energy target. And then we've got to work hard. People like those in this room have got to work hard thinking through how you structure the alternative fiscal mechanisms in the absence of a carbon price to internalise the important externalities that will determine whether or not Australia plays its part in the world decarbonisation effort and uses its opportunity to grab a long period of economic expansion on the basis of these new industries. Australia's natural and historical advantages in the zero carbon world are so large that a decade of policy incoherence has not been able to negate them. But we should not test our good fortune any longer. You don't know how long your luck will last. Judicious application of the best of international economic analysis can help us to move forward with confidence in unlocking the manifold benefits for Australia and the world in building Australia as the renewable energy superpower of the zero carbon world economy. Thank you.
All right, so now we get an opportunity to practice our clarity and precision in terms of asking questions. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. So I think we've got some mics running around. So if anyone has a question, Beth.
Thanks very much, Ross, for the presentation. Beth Webster from Swinburne University. I'm really interested in your comments about how we can potentially become the green steel sort of superpower of the world. It sort of does have echoes of the early 1980s when, you know, we were going to be saved by downstream processing of all our mineral products, and that you probably know why that didn't succeed. But I believe it was because we never really got the economies of scale to make that viable. What do you think we need this time to get the economies of scale or the supply chains efficient enough to make the green steel promise?
Yeah, the big difference, Australia is the world's biggest and best exporter of metallurgical coal. So we are a huge supplier of coal and gas to world markets, and by far the world's biggest exporter of metallurgical coal. And the thought often occurred to people that putting together Australian iron ore and metallurgical coal would be the basis of an internationally competitive industry. And there was something in that idea. One disadvantage is that the coal was in Queensland and New South Wales, and the iron ore in Western Australia and South Australia, and Australian domestic transport costs unbelievably high and much cheaper to ship metallurgical coal from Mackay to Corden than from Mackay to Whyalla. But in their nature, coal, gas, the old fossil, and oil for that matter, the old fossil sources of energy and carbon reductants are relatively cheap to transport. The cost of getting Queensland metallurgical coal to Kobe or Shanghai or Fushan is less than 10%, often closer to 5% of the value of the product. It's not like that with renewable energy or hydrogen. The main alternative as the technology stands now is zero emissions hydrogen made from renewable energy, splitting the water. You could take the renewable energy to Asia from Australia in submarine cables. Cannon Brooks is spending a lot of money planning to do that to Singapore. I hope it works, but the cost of that cable is going to be much more than the value at the Australian end of the electricity. It'll more than double the cost. So while that power might be very good for providing air conditioning for Singapore offices and fuel for electric cars, it's not going to be the basis of internationally competitive manufacturing industries. It'll just be too expensive. It will be less than half as expensive in Australia as there. Well, you could turn it into hydrogen, and you can liquefy hydrogen and send that overseas the same way as we do LNG. But hydrogen will not liquefy until you're almost to absolute zero. And your sister's a professor of physics. She can tell us all that that the closer you get to absolute zero, the harder it is to get down temperature, and you use more than half of the energy in hydrogen simply to liquefy it. And hydrogen's the smallest atom and smallest molecule in the atmosphere. It seeps out of the molecules of steel. So you can build a special ship with special materials so it doesn't leak out, but it's more expensive. And the hydrogen's going to cost more than twice as much in Japan or Korea or Germany or China than it costs in Australia. So the pure economics drives you to processing Australian iron ore, or for that matter, through different processes, aluminium, silicon, other products, in Australia rather than overseas. The zero carbon economy has very different transport economics, which will have very different effects on Australian opportunity. We would have to be very, very, very inefficient compared with everyone else for us not to be the low-cost producer. We might be able to manage it, but we'd have to continue with the incoherence of the last 10 years.
All right, so we've got time for one more question, and Leslie has the mic.
So when you listed the renewables, you mentioned biomass. How should I think of biomass in a context where we have cycles of water scarcity and high risk and increasingly high risk of bushfires?
Yeah, the biomass that I think is Australia has a potential advantage in is the Australian native species that are adapted to this fire-prone and variable climate. We've got quite a few acacias and eucalypts that can grow reasonably well in with relatively low rainfall, but above all with variable rainfall. It will take a lot of science, a lot of good knowledge of plants to do this well and sustainably, but using that opportunity adds up to a very big advantage for Australia. We've got a big continent and not many people. Just looking at woodlands, where there are already areas where there's already trees growing, Australia's got 10 times the woodlands per capita of the developed countries as a whole, and developed countries as a whole have got several times per capita the woodlands of the developing countries. That's just a crude indicator of the potential, but the potential will come from, can be realised through using clever botanical science, applied science, to making good use of the characteristics of Australian species that are adapted to our hot and variable and fire-prone environment.
All right, thank you. All right, well, sadly we have to bring this lecture to an end, but first I'd like to thank Ross for providing a stimulating and really provoking lecture for us to take away with, and we have this small gift for you. But please join me in thanking Ross.